My daughter threw wine at me and said, "My stepdad is better than you. Why did you come to my wedding?" I thought she was joking when she said I wasn't invited to her wedding. Everyone laughed and mocked me, so I calmly left. The next morning, I sent her a message. "You are no longer my daughter. You can forget about me from today." What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. First, if you enjoy these kinds of stories, support us by subscribing to this channel. Click on the like button and tell us where you are watching us from in the comments section. Now let me tell you how everything unfolded. I used to think that a father's love, if constant and unwavering, was enough to hold a relationship together, no matter how frayed or distant it had become. I wasn't the perfect dad, I'll be the first to admit that. I missed too many recitals, forgot birthdays once or twice, and poured more of myself into my business than into bedtime stories. But I never stopped showing up when it mattered. I paid for her private school, her first car, every one of her bills. Even the therapy sessions she said were to deal with childhood trauma, I apparently gave her. I didn't argue. I just paid. Because that's what I thought love looked like in the real world, showing up when the receipts needed signing. So when my daughter, Madison, texted me 2 months before her wedding and said, "Don't bother coming," I genuinely thought it was a joke. A cruel one, maybe, but she always had that sharp tongue. I read the message, stared at it for a while, and chuckled under my breath, thinking, she's being dramatic again. I figured I'd show up anyway, as any father would, because that's what I do. I show up. The wedding was on a crisp Saturday afternoon in early September, held at one of those rustic vineyards just outside the city, the kind of place that looks like it was built for Instagram photos rather than vows. I arrived in a charcoal gray suit, the one she once said made me look distinguished, like someone who owns a yacht. I walked in with a bottle of vintage wine I had brought as a gift, one that had been aging in my cellar since the year she was born. I thought it would be poetic. Something full circle. I imagined giving it to her during the reception, maybe even saying a few words. I didn't expect a red carpet, but I didn't expect what came next either. The moment I stepped into the reception hall, the room shifted. Heads turned, and for a second, there was a pause, an odd, sharp silence. Then laughter. Not the warm, welcoming kind. The cruel, mocking kind, as if I were the butt of a joke that everyone else was in on. And in the center of it all, my daughter, my Madison, stood there in her wedding dress, wine glass in hand, smirking like a villain in someone else's story. "What the hell are you doing here?" she said, loud enough for the room to hear. Some people gasped. Others laughed harder. I blinked, frozen in place. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. I must have looked ridiculous standing there, still holding that bottle of wine like an idiot. I took a step forward, thinking she'd crack a smile and say, "Gotcha," like she used to when she pulled pranks as a kid. But instead, she raised her glass, looked me dead in the eye, and with the calm of someone placing a final chess piece, she said, "My stepdad is better than you. Why did you come?" Then, before I could even process those words, she threw the wine. Not at the floor, not at the wall, at me. A splash of red hit my shirt, my jacket, even my face. The crowd erupted. Some in horror, most in laughter. One of her bridesmaids actually clapped. I didn't say a word. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I looked at her one last time, waiting for a flicker of remorse, a hint of the little girl who once held my hand during thunderstorms. There was none. Just that same cruel smirk, the same dismissive eyes. So I did the only thing I could. I placed the bottle of wine gently on the nearest table, turned around, and walked out. I didn't run. I didn't curse. I didn't ask why. I just walked, each step heavier than the last, the laughter still echoing behind me like a chorus of betrayal. Driving home, the silence in the car was suffocating. I could still feel the wetness of the wine on my chest, the sting of her words settling deeper with every mile. I kept trying to find an explanation that would make it hurt less. Maybe she's drunk. Maybe someone told her I was coming and she felt cornered. Maybe this is some twisted cry for attention. But deep down, I knew none of that was true. Madison had made her choice. And it wasn't me. What broke me wasn't the wine. It wasn't the public humiliation. It was the realization that I had shown up thinking I was still her father, and she had decided a long time ago that I wasn't. And somehow, I had missed it. When I got home, I took off my suit, poured myself a drink, and sat alone in the living room staring at a framed photo of us from when she was 9. Her smile in that picture used to be my favorite thing in the world. I remembered how proud she was that day. We had built a treehouse together, and she kept calling me the best dad ever. That little girl was gone now. In her place stood a woman I didn't recognize. And I had to finally face the truth. I wasn't the father of the bride. I was a stranger with a wallet. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat in silence, heartbroken but strangely calm. Around 6 a.m., I picked up my phone and typed the message with shaking fingers. You are no longer my daughter. You can forget about me from today. I stared at it for a long time before pressing send. When I finally did, I felt something shift inside me. Not peace, not anger, just finality. A door closing, a bond severed. I stood up, walked into my home office, and began making the calls that would set the rest of it in motion. The first call I made that morning was to my bank. My voice was steady, which surprised even me, considering how wrecked I felt only hours before. I told the representative I wanted to remove all authorized users from my personal credit cards, especially Madison. She'd had access to them since college, a safety net I never pulled away, even when she started earning on her own. I gave her that financial lifeline not because she needed it, but because I thought it was a father's duty to make life easier for his child. For years, she used those cards like they were her own: flights, dinners, designer dresses, even wedding expenses, all quietly covered by me. And I never once asked for thanks. I told myself that one day, she'd look back and understand that I gave her that freedom out of love. But now, as I listened to the rep confirm her access had been revoked, all I could think was how foolish I had been. Love shouldn't be mistaken for sponsorship. And I had let her turn me into a walking, breathing ATM. After the bank, I called the phone company and canceled her line. It was still on my family plan, a plan I started when she was 13 and wanted her first iPhone. Even after she moved out, even after she stopped visiting on holidays, I kept paying it. Part of me hoped it would be a lifeline she'd use to call me on a quiet Sunday, just to say, "Hey Dad, I miss you." That call never came. The line was silent, month after month, except for the data usage and bills I kept blindly covering. I had treated these bills like habits, like brushing my teeth or paying the water bill. I didn't question them, because in my heart, I still believed we were connected. But after the wedding, after the wine, after that public mockery, I finally saw what had been true for a long time. Those lines were one way. I was the only one reaching out. The hardest call, though, wasn't to a company. It was to my lawyer. Madison worked at the family business, my company, not because she earned it, but because I offered her a seat at the table. I thought that giving her a role, even a minor one, would help us stay close. She barely showed up most days, and when she did, she acted like she was doing everyone a favor. But I made excuses for her. She's finding herself, I'd say. Let her explore. I didn't want to be the controlling father. I wanted to be the understanding one. But as I paced my office that morning, I realized how much of my dignity I had compromised under the disguise of patience. So I called my attorney and told him to prepare her termination documents. No more paycheck. No more position. No more handouts. This was no longer a family favor. It was a business decision, and as CEO and as her father, I was officially done enabling the behavior that led to this mess. I sent the message to her around 8:30 a.m., just a few hours after I had typed it. It was short, cold, and deliberate. You are no longer my daughter. You can forget about me from today. No flourishes, no emotion, no room for interpretation. I knew she'd read it. Madison always read my messages, even if she pretended to ignore them. I didn't expect a reply, and for the next 3 days, I didn't get one. Instead, there was silence, a thick, unfamiliar quiet that hung around my house like fog. No follow-up message, no apology, no shocked voicemail, just complete, almost arrogant silence, as if she was waiting for me to take it back, to apologize for embarrassing her. But I didn't budge. I knew this time had to be different. If I so much as cracked the door open, she'd walk back in with her entitlement, her cold smirks, and the same smug belief that she could treat me like a backup plan. Those 3 days were the loneliest of my life, and I've had some lonely ones. There's a special kind of ache that comes with cutting off your own child. I kept replaying that moment in the wedding hall over and over again. The wine, the laughter, the look in her eyes like I was the joke of the evening. I asked myself questions I had no answers for. When did she stop loving me? When did I become the villain in her story? And more than anything, was there something I missed, some moment, some fracture that could have been mended before it broke completely? But those questions didn't help. They just circled the drain in my mind until I was too exhausted to think anymore. On the third day, around noon, my phone rang. I saw her name light up on the screen, and for a moment, just a fleeting second, I hoped it was a call to make things right. Not for reconciliation. I didn't need that. But maybe something real. An acknowledgement. A piece of the daughter I used to know. I answered and said nothing at first. I just listened. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she snapped. "I tried to book our honeymoon flight, and your stupid card got declined. What game are you playing?" Her tone wasn't broken. It wasn't sad. It was pissed off, entitled, like I had inconvenienced her. Like my humiliation at her wedding wasn't worth a second thought. I swallowed hard and said quietly, "Call your stepdad." There was a long silence on the other end. "Excuse me," she spat. I repeated it, louder this time. "Call your stepdad. I'm done being taken advantage of." And then, for the first time, I added the part one had never said aloud. The part one had been too ashamed to admit, even to myself. "You didn't deserve any of it." She screamed something back. I don't even remember what. Something about me being bitter, pathetic, a loser who couldn't handle that she'd moved on. I let her rant. I didn't hang up. I wanted to hear every cruel word. I wanted to remember them the next time I doubted whether I did the right thing. Eventually, she hung up. I stared at the phone for a long time afterward, not angry, not even surprised. Just empty. Like all the air had left the room and taken something essential with it. I walked outside and sat on the porch, letting the late summer heat soak into my skin. Across the lawn, a neighbor's kid was riding a scooter, laughing, carefree. And for a moment, I felt the weight of every fatherly instinct I still carried. I hadn't stopped being a father. I had just stopped being her father. And there was a strange, aching peace in that realization. I hadn't abandoned her. I had protected myself, for the first time in years. 3 days after I cut her off, after the wine and the text and the silence that followed, I got the call that should have broken me. Instead, it clarified everything. I was at the office that morning, sitting behind the same desk that had once held her preschool drawings and later, her internship paperwork. I remember staring at a faded crayon sketch of a lopsided house and stick figure versions of us, me with square glasses, her with yellow scribbled hair. And thinking how impossible it was that the same hand that once drew those lines now pointed a wine glass at me like a weapon. My phone buzzed with a name I'd known all her life. Madison. There was a tight knot in my stomach, but I didn't hesitate to answer. I wanted to hear her voice. I needed to hear who she had become without my help. "What the hell is wrong with you?" she snapped before I could say a word. No greeting. No softness. Just venom, sharp and immediate. I tried booking our honeymoon flight, and the card declined. "I'm stranded at the airport with Jason like a damn fool. Are you seriously doing this right now?" Her voice rose with each word, layered with outrage, not confusion, not even sadness. She wasn't calling to ask what had happened. She knew what had happened. And more importantly, she knew why. But entitlement, it turns out, doesn't leave much room for accountability. I could hear airport noise in the background. Announcements, chatter, the faint beep of scanners. For a brief second, I imagined her standing there in designer sunglasses and a white carry-on, flustered and furious, while Jason scrolled through his phone like this wasn't his problem. That's when it hit me. She didn't want a father. She wanted a sponsor. She wanted a fallback plan when the image of her perfect life cracked. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "Call your stepdad." The line went quiet, just for a beat, as if she couldn't quite process the shift in power. "Excuse me," she hissed. I said it again, slowly, like I wanted her to taste every syllable. "Call your stepdad." There was a pause, and then the explosion. "You are such a bitter old man," she barked. Is this your little revenge for the wedding? Grow up. You embarrassed yourself. Nobody wanted you there. You made everything worse just by showing up. You look pathetic. That's why everyone laughed. Her words came fast, cruel, rehearsed. And each one was a nail in the coffin. But strangely, they didn't hurt the way I expected them to. They didn't pierce. They confirmed. She wanted to punish me, not for what I did, but for no longer letting her walk all over me. I let her rant. I listened to every insult. I wanted to remember them, not out of spite, but for clarity. Because when grief plays tricks on the heart, it's easy to romanticize what was never real. She kept going, accusing me of manipulation, calling me a narcissist, telling me I was never really a father, just a guy with money. And maybe part of that was true. Maybe I had leaned too hard on financial gestures instead of emotional ones. Maybe I had used my wallet when I should have used my words. But I also knew that money was never the point. It was the care behind it, the quiet, invisible love of always catching someone before they fell. I didn't know her money. I gave it. And she spat it back in my face like it meant nothing. Finally, when her voice cracked from shouting, I spoke. You didn't deserve any of it, I said calmly. Not the cards. Not the phone. Not the job. I gave you those things because I believed we still had something worth protecting. But you made it clear, I'm nothing to you. So now, you're nothing to me. There was a long silence. The kind that felt final. I could almost hear the breath catch in her throat. But even then, she didn't apologize. She didn't ask why it hurt so much. She just scoffed and hung up. No goodbye. No hesitation. Just a click in dead air. I sat at my desk afterward, staring at the blinking cursor on an empty document. My hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow. Not aching, just vacant. It was like the part of me that had clung to her for so long had finally let go, and now there was space where pain used to be. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there, feeling the enormity of what had just happened settle around me like dust. It wasn't just a conversation. It was a severance. A final chapter closing itself with no fanfare, no redemption arc, no quiet hug at the end. Just the truth, bare and unforgiving. Later that afternoon, I called HR at the office and confirmed her removal had been finalized. I didn't tell them the full story. I didn't need to. I simply said she would no longer be involved in the company, and they handled the rest. I cleaned out her small office space myself that evening, taking down the fake diploma she had framed from some online course she never finished, tossing out untouched notebooks and a half-dead plant she'd forgotten to water. As I boxed everything up, I realized how little of her was actually present in that space. It was a placeholder, just like our relationship had become. A symbolic seat at the table, nothing more. When I got home, the silence felt different than it had before. Not oppressive, not sad, just real, like a room that had finally stopped pretending to be full. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, sat on the couch, and let the quiet wrap around me like a weighted blanket. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for a text from her. I wasn't hoping for a call. I wasn't checking my phone like some lovesick teenager. I just sat there, breathing, existing, whole in a way I hadn't been in a long time. I knew there would be consequences. Family drama doesn't go quiet for long. Word would spread. Cousins would call. Old friends would ask questions. But none of that mattered anymore. The only person I had been trying to reach all these years had made her choice. And so had I. And in that moment, as the sun dipped low outside my window, painting the room in golden shadows, I felt something I hadn't felt since she was a little girl and used to fall asleep in the back seat after long drives. I felt peace. The gossip started the next morning, like it always does in families where loyalty runs thinner than blood. It began with a text from my sister, Lena, short, sharp, and clearly laced with judgment. What the hell happened at the wedding? That's all she wrote. But I could already hear her voice behind the screen, the high-pitched skepticism that always made me feel like a kid again, like I was being scolded for something I didn't know I'd done wrong. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready for whatever performance Lena had rehearsed with the rest of the family. It had only been a few days since I pulled the plug, on the money, on the business ties, on the title of dad, that had become more of a punchline than a role, and already, the secondhand noise was starting. I knew Madison wouldn't call me to explain herself, but I underestimated how fast she'd run to her audience. And they were ready, eager, even, to hear her version. By noon, 3 more relatives had messaged me. My cousin Darren, who I hadn't spoken to in 2 years, asked if I was feeling okay, as if maybe I'd lost my mind. My Aunt Dolores left a voicemail full of long sighs and passive-aggressive concern, hinting that Madison was in tears and trying so hard to fix things, which I knew was a lie. Madison didn't cry. Madison complained. There's a difference. And then came the kicker, a call from my mother. I stared at the screen, hesitated, then picked up. I didn't want to, but I knew if I let her go to voicemail, she'd just show up at my house uninvited, and I wasn't in the mood for surprise visits or guilt trips served with homemade cookies. Is it true? She asked before even saying hello. Her voice was soft but stern, like a warning wrapped in worry. I stayed quiet, waiting. That you cut her off? Fired her? Canceled her phone and everything? I sighed. Yes, Mom. It's true. She clicked her tongue, that disapproving little sound she'd used since I was 5, and broke her favorite vase. You didn't even try to talk it through? I nearly laughed at that, the irony so thick it almost choked me. Talk it through? She threw wine at me in front of 200 people and told me her stepdad was better. That was the conversation. My mother paused, likely processing the image. But instead of outrage or comfort, she sighed again. Still, that's your daughter. That sentence, that's your daughter, landed harder than I expected. Because yes, biologically, emotionally, historically, she was. But the woman who publicly humiliated me, who screamed down the phone because I wouldn't fund her honeymoon, who ran to the family with crocodile tears and half-truths, that person wasn't the girl I raised. She was someone else. Someone molded by resentment, entitlement, or maybe just years of misunderstanding we never resolved. She made her choice, Ma, I said quietly. I'm just following her lead. My mother didn't like that. She muttered something about forgiveness, about how time would heal things, about how kids don't always know what they're doing. But she didn't defend my pain. She didn't say I was right to walk away. She just wanted the problem to go away without the mess. That was the problem with family. They want unity, even when it's built on bruises. That afternoon, Tom stopped by. He's my neighbor and an old friend from way back when our kids played soccer on the same team. He wasn't the emotional type, which made his timing even more meaningful. He didn't call first. He just showed up with 2 coffees and said, I figured you'd need something warm. I nodded, took the cup, and we sat on the porch like we used to in the old days when life felt more manageable. I heard what happened, he said after a long silence. Whole neighborhoods buzzing. I smiled bitterly. Of course they are. He looked at me, dead in the eye, and said something that stuck. You didn't lose her this week. You lost her a long time ago. This just made it official. It was brutal, but it was true. And I appreciated it more than all the soft platitudes the rest of the family was handing out like candy. We talked for a while, about kids, regret, growing older and realizing the people you'd die for wouldn't even bother sending flowers to your funeral. Tom shared a story about his own daughter, how she stopped talking to him for years after he refused to pay her rent when she quit her job to find herself in Costa Rica. She came around, he said, eventually, but not because I caved, because life humbled her. That part stuck with me, not because I expected the same outcome with Madison, but because I realized I wasn't the only one who'd been there. Other fathers had stood in the same silence, facing the same impossible heartbreak of choosing dignity over DNA. Later that evening, I checked my social media for the first time since the wedding. I hadn't posted anything, but Madison had. A long, carefully curated caption with a picture of her and Jason boarding a plane, private lounge, champagne in hand, matching luggage. Sometimes the real family is the one you choose, it read. Dozens of likes. Comments from friends calling her brave, inspiring. One of her college friends wrote, "So glad you cut out toxic energy. You deserve peace." I stared at it, equal parts stunned and numb. There I was, reduced to toxic energy. The man who paid her tuition, drove her to every internship interview, who stayed up with her the night her dog had to be put down. I was now a footnote in her self-love narrative. And still, I didn't comment. I didn't reach out. I didn't defend myself. Because when you've been cast as the villain in someone else's story, trying to rewrite your part only makes you look desperate. That night, I turned off my phone, sat down with a pen, and wrote a letter I never intended to send. It wasn't angry. It wasn't poetic. It was just mine. I wrote about the day she was born, how terrified I was holding her in my arms, how I promised then and there to never let her down. I wrote about her first day of kindergarten, the time she cried when I forgot her lunch, how I drove back across town just to make sure she had her favorite juice box. I wrote about the years I thought we were unbreakable and the slow erosion I ignored out of fear. I wrote it all, not for her, but for me, to remember that I hadn't always been this cold, that I had tried, that my love was once loud, messy, and full of effort, and that somewhere along the way, it had died from neglect. I folded the letter and placed it in my desk drawer, next to the photograph of us building her treehouse, the same one that used to sit on my nightstand. I didn't cry. I didn't feel peace. But I felt clarity. And sometimes, that's all you can ask for when the people you love most teach you how to live without them. It wasn't until a week after the wedding that I began hearing the real story, or at least the pieces that had been carefully hidden behind Madison's public performance. The truth, as it tends to do, arrived not in a dramatic confrontation but through whispers, screenshots, and awkward conversations from people who thought I deserved to know. It started with a message from my niece, Katie. She was younger, still in college, and never fully bought into Madison's carefully curated social image. Katie had always been one of the few family members who didn't treat me like I was either a failure or a checkbook. She texted me late one night, "Hey, I didn't want to stir anything, but you should see this." Attached was a screenshot of a group chat between Madison and some of her friends. And there I was, mentioned by name, mocked in all caps, referred to as the sperm donor, the bank account, and worse. I stared at the words for several minutes, unable to blink. It was one thing to be dismissed. It was another to be dehumanized for laughs. In one message, Madison bragged about how she was going to let him show up to the wedding just so we could all laugh when security turned him away. That explained the laughter, the smirks, the cruel timing of her outburst. It wasn't a moment of drunken rage or last-minute nerves. It was planned, designed to humiliate me. One of her friends even replied with, "OMG, that's savage, queen energy." Another wrote, "He's lucky you didn't throw the bottle instead of just the wine." I felt sick. This wasn't a daughter venting in pain. This was a daughter enjoying the destruction of a man who had done nothing but try to show up, even when he wasn't wanted. It wasn't rebellion. It was cruelty. And the worst part? They were all laughing. But what stunned me more than the group chat was the thread of messages involving Jason, her stepfather. In a separate exchange, Madison told a friend, "Jason says I should cut off Dad completely. He's always thought Dad was just a try-hard loser anyway. Can't believe I wasted so many years pretending to care." That sentence hit harder than anything she'd said to my face. Because I'd always suspected that Jason, the man her mother married when Madison was 16, wasn't exactly fond of me. He was passive-aggressive at best and dismissive at worst, the kind of guy who shook your hand but never looked you in the eye. I'd kept my distance, partly out of respect and partly because every interaction with him felt like a silent competition I hadn't signed up for. But I never once spoke ill of him to Madison. I never made her choose. I never compared bank accounts or parenting styles or tried to edge him out. I just stayed in my lane. And now, I was learning that he'd been sowing seeds against me behind closed doors for years. I reached out to Katie and thanked her for sending the messages, though I could tell she felt awkward about it. "I know she's family," she wrote, "but what she did was messed up. You didn't deserve that." That was the first time anyone in the family had said those exact words to me. Not, "Give it time." Not, "She's just emotional." But "You didn't deserve that." And it hit me how rare that validation had been throughout this entire ordeal. Most people wanted me to be the bigger person, to forgive, to absorb the damage and smile anyway. But not Katie. She saw the manipulation for what it was. And in that moment, her honesty felt like a lifeline. Over the next few days, more truths surfaced. A former assistant at my company, someone Madison had treated poorly, sent me a message on LinkedIn. She thanked me for finally doing what needed to be done and mentioned how Madison used to brag about barely working while still cashing paychecks. She even laughed once about buying Jason a new watch on Daddy's dime. The assistant said she didn't speak up earlier because, as she put it, I figured you knew and just didn't care. That hurt in a different way. To think that my silence had looked like complicity, that my efforts to avoid conflict had painted me as a fool. One evening, I sat down with my accountant to review the past year's spending, something I hadn't done closely in months. What I found made my stomach turn. Thousands of dollars in unapproved expenses, luxury items, spa weekends, travel, not just for Madison, but for her mother and Jason. I had been funding their lifestyle without realizing it. They were using me like a silent investor in a life I wasn't even allowed to witness. And all the while, Jason had the audacity to speak my name with disdain, to call me a tryhard. I felt the heat rise in my chest, not just from anger, but from embarrassment. I had let it happen. I had handed them the keys to my generosity, and they had driven it straight into betrayal. I called a friend that night, Dave, an old college buddy who ran his own business and had gone through a bitter divorce with similar parental manipulation. I told him everything. The wine, the call, the group chats, the stolen money. He didn't say much at first, just listened. And then he said something that stuck with me. They're not mad you walked away. They're mad the ATM finally asked for a PIN. That made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was painfully true. They didn't want me back. They wanted the benefits of my presence without the burden of respecting it. The next day, I went back to the lawyer, not just to update the business paperwork, but to begin revising my will. Madison was removed as a beneficiary. All trusts dissolved. The family home would go to charity. The business would transfer to a foundation. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it to make a statement. Not just to her, but to myself. That love, real love, cannot thrive in places where manipulation masquerades as family. That blood may be thicker than water, but dignity is thicker than both. By the end of that week, my phone had gone quiet. Madison hadn't called again. Jason hadn't reached out. Her mother sent one vague message that said, "You really know how to cause a scene," as if my boundary setting was the problem. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't playing defense anymore. I wasn't chasing approval or holding out hope. I was just done, and it felt like freedom. 3 weeks passed without a single word from Madison. Not a call, not a message, not even one of those passive-aggressive posts she loved to make when she wanted the world to believe she was healing from something traumatic, when really, she just hated being held accountable. I checked her socials one more time, out of habit more than curiosity, and saw she had changed her last name on every profile. She was now Madison Carter, Jason's last name. Not hyphenated. No mention of the name I had given her, the name that once sat proudly on her diploma, the name she used to draw hearts around as a child. It was gone, erased, like I'd never existed. And as much as it should have hurt, it didn't. Not in the way you'd expect. It felt more like a final click of a lock turning, a quiet seal on a door that had already closed weeks ago. What struck me in those following days wasn't the silence, but how peaceful it felt. My house was still. My phone, mercifully calm. I no longer lived with the constant tension of wondering when the next crisis would land in my lap, the next demand, the next ungrateful sigh over a favor she'd never return. The emotional bandwidth I had spent for years trying to win back her affection, trying to mend something that was already broken beyond repair, it was suddenly mine again. And in that quiet, I did something I hadn't done in years. I started living like I wasn't constantly waiting to be needed. I woke up early, made coffee just for myself, and took long walks through the neighborhood. I read books without checking my phone every 10 minutes. I called old friends, rekindled connections that had fallen to the side while I was too busy trying to fix something that didn't want to be fixed. But even in this newfound stillness, there were reminders. Little echoes of her presence in my home. Her old bedroom door, slightly ajar, revealing the faded blue walls and an empty bookshelf. A box of trophies and school photos I had packed away but never thrown out. The piano she never finished learning to play. Some nights, I'd sit in the hallway with a glass of whiskey, staring at that room and wondering when she had stopped being mine. Not legally, not biologically, but emotionally. Maybe it had been during the divorce. Maybe when Jason started buying her things I wouldn't. Or maybe I had always been temporary in her eyes, a placeholder until something shinier came along. I didn't have the answer. I probably never would. But what I did know was this. I had done my part. I had shown up. I had loved her the best I could, even when she made it impossible to be close. One morning, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was hers. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single page, typed, not handwritten, as if even now, she couldn't bring herself to touch the paper directly with emotion. The letter was cold, clipped, and distant. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply said, "I think it's best we go our separate ways permanently. I don't want anything else from you. Jason and I are moving forward with our own life, and I hope you can respect that." At the bottom, she had typed her full name again, Madison Carter. No love, no sincerely. Just her name, like a formality. I folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer where I had put the one I had written weeks before, the one I never sent. Two stories sitting side by side, one full of memory, the other full of finality. That night, I made a decision. I took the letter, the photos, the childhood drawings, and the dusty little trinkets she'd left behind over the years, and I packed them all into a box. I didn't throw them away. I couldn't bring myself to do that. But I moved them to the attic, out of sight. Not out of anger, but because I needed to create space for what came next. Grief is a strange companion. It lingers long after the person is gone. Not because you miss them, but because you miss the version of them you once believed in. I wasn't grieving Madison. I was grieving the father I had tried to be, the one who stayed, who sacrificed, who hoped. And now that hope was gone, and in its place stood something steadier, acceptance. A few days later, I updated my will. The lawyer didn't ask why. He had heard the rumors, probably pieced together most of it. He simply nodded and made the changes. Madison was removed. In her place, I named a local youth mentorship program as the sole beneficiary, an organization that helped kids whose parents had given up on them. I figured if I couldn't give my love to someone who wanted it, maybe I could give it to kids who needed it. Ones who might see me not as a walking wallet, but as someone who could show up in ways that mattered. Real ways. Human ways. In the weeks that followed, I got calls from a few family members. Some who had finally learned the truth, others who still believed Madison's version. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just told them the same thing, every time. This isn't up for debate. Because it wasn't. My decision wasn't a reaction. It was a reckoning. A hard-earned boundary drawn from years of betrayal, disappointment, and quiet heartbreak. And once I drew it, I realized how long overdue it had been. It's been months now. Madison is gone from my life, not in death, but in distance. I no longer check her socials. I don't ask mutual friends how she's doing. I don't track her like a man waiting for signs of remorse. I've let her go in every way that matters. Not because I stopped loving her, but because I started loving myself more. If you've ever had to walk away from a family member to protect your peace, you're not alone. Sometimes the hardest boundaries we set are the ones closest to home, but that doesn't make them any less necessary. Let me know in the comments. Have you ever had to cut off someone you once would have done anything for? How did it change you? And do you believe some relationships simply can't be saved? If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories about family, choices, and the strength it takes to finally let go. See you soon in the next story.